Now we can start building our actual characters in Photoshop. Now I'm going to break this up into two parts. So the first part is going to be with this character, whom we're going to create in a more realistic way with shading and lighting. And then we're going to color this guy in a more simplistic way with just solid colors. Once we've done that, we're going to go ahead and I'm going to show you how to animate this character. So let's get started. So the first thing we want to do is we want to block out the values of our character. And by values, that means the level between black and white. So if you take all the color away from this character, he'll be left with either shades of gray, black, or white. So for example, if his shirt was a dark red and you took all the red out of it, it would end up being a dark gray. Now before we start blocking these values in, I want to go ahead and take our two sketch layers, this layer and this layer, and put them into a folder. Now what this means is it just means they're going to be grouped together so we can keep things more organized. So I'm just going to select both of them. Then I'm going to come down here at the bottom right hand corner of the screen, and there's a little folder icon next to the new layer icon. So I'm going to hit that folder and it's going to place both those layers in that folder. Now you can see when I turn that folder off, it turns off all the layers within that folder. Next, I'm going to create a new layer. Now let's go ahead and select the polygonal lasso tool. So the polygonal lasso tool, if you remember, is the one where you can select straight lines. So what we want to do is we want to go in there and trace out these shapes that make up this character's body. We're going to start off with the head. Now let's go ahead and zoom in. The way you zoom in is by hitting the Z on your keyboard, and you'll see your cursor becomes a magnifying glass. Now what you want to do is click and drag in, and it'll zoom you in. Now in order to move around the page, you need to hit the space bar on your keyboard. Hold that down while you click and drag, and it'll allow you to drag all over the page. So let's bring it into his face. And now switching back to our lasso tool, we're going to start tracing out his face. So we'll start about here underneath his goggles. And we're just going to trace around the shape of his face. Now remember, the smaller the curves, the closer you need your lines to be so you can get more of that curve in there. And we don't need to do all of his hair because his hair is going to be a different color than his skin. So come back to the beginning of your shape and close it. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to fill that shape in with a light gray. So we're going to come over to our color selector and bring it all the way over to the left side of the color palette. And then we're going to bring it up to about there. We'll hit OK. And now using our color fill tool, which is this tool right here, it looks like a paint bucket. You may be selected on the gradient tool. If you are, just go ahead and hold down on it and bring it to the paint bucket tool. So with the paint bucket tool, what you can do with this is fill shapes in. So if we click on our selection, you'll see it fills that shape in. Next, we need to label this layer so we can stay organized. So we're going to label the layer head. While we're at it, let's label our folder too. So we're going to label this folder sketch. So now we need to do the same thing with all the shapes. We need to make a new layer, trace out the shape, and fill it with a value. Now when you're filling in your values, it's important to remember that you want contrast. That's the whole reason why we do the values before we do the color, is we want to make sure there's contrast in the image. Images without contrast or with little contrast usually don't look very good at all. So what is contrast exactly? Contrast is just the difference between two values. So black and white have very high contrast. You can see the difference between them when they're right next to each other. mid-gray and another mid-gray together, you can hardly see any contrast between them. It's almost hard to tell the difference between them. So you want to make sure that there are big differences between each colors that are touching. So, for example, his skin is pretty light, but his scarf is going to be touching his skin. So we want to make that scarf a darker color. So let's go ahead and add a new layer. Switch over to the lasso tool, and we'll start tracing that shape out. And now we're going to fill that with a darker color. So I'm going to bring the color down to a pretty dark gray, about there. Then using the fill tool, whose hotkey is the letter G, we're going to fill that in. Now you can see there's a good contrast between his light skin and his dark scarf. Now I know his scarf is on top of his head. All we have to do to fix that is click his layer and drag it down beneath the head layer. And now his scarf is behind the head. Now let's label that layer scarf. Next, let's do his hair. So to do his hair, I'm going to turn off his head layer so I can see the sketch underneath this lighter gray layer. So we'll hit the I button and turn that off. Now let's create a new layer. And using the lasso tool again, we will trace out that shape. Now I just want to keep that shape from touching right before the goggles end. That way we can still see his skin and the hair. Now we're going to fill his hair in with a gradient. What a gradient is it's a transition between two different colors. We can come over here to the paint bucket tool and hold it down, and it'll come up with the option for the gradient tool. So let's select that. Now the gradient tool is going to create that gradient between these two colors right here, our foreground color and our background color. So let's make sure we have the correct colors in there that we want the gradient to be created in. So the first color I want is going to be a very light gray, almost a white. We'll hit OK. The second color I want is going to be about a mid gray, so about where it is now. I'm going to go a little bit higher actually, to about there. And those are the colors I want for his hair. So now you'll see if we click on our document, we get a line. Now this line is the length and direction of our gradient. So if I let go of it here, it's going to be going in this direction and it's going to have this length, which means from this point to that point, it's going to transition between my two colors. So the longer I make it, the longer the transition is going to be. Let me show you what I mean. So if I let go of my gradient right here, it's going to make a long transition between this dark gray and this light gray. But if we undo that and I make that line shorter, you can see that transition happens right there, and everything on the other side of those 2 points is that solid color selection. So in this case, I want a long transition between here and here. So just the tip of his hair is darker. Now, I don't like the direction it's going in. I want it to be coming more from the top. So I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to select from the top and come down to about there. Perfect. Now we can go ahead and turn that head layer back on and see what it looks like. Alright, it's looking pretty good. Now let's go ahead and label the hair layer. And we'll just call it hair. Next, let's create those goggles. So we're going to turn off our hair layer and our head layer so we can see the goggles on the sketch. Then let's add a new layer. And using the lasso tool once again, we're going to trace out that shape. Now, if the shape isn't perfect on your sketch, you can kind of go ahead Then let's fill that in with a dark gray, almost a black. Make sure that you're on your paint bucket and not your gradient, and fill that in. Awesome. Now let's turn on our two other layers. Alright, it's looking good.